That should be going now. Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. So, I really wanted today. We've I think we missed last week. Is that right? Last week was Shiva Sabbatamos, right? So, I'd like today to try and finish discussing the life of the Ramah and begin dipping into his philosophy and Rabbi Caro's philosophy, which, after all, is what this is about. So, a reminder of the historical context, which we discussed 2 weeks ago. The Ashkenazi world has had this massive population shift from West Europe, primarily Germany, into the great, vast, wild east of East Europe. And this has actually taken place over several stages. From already the 1200s, there's a beginning of the migration eastwards, but certainly now when we arrive in the late 1400s, early 1500s, there's this vast Jewish population now in East Europe. So interestingly, both the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi world have shifted population centers. Spain, because of the enormous trauma of the expulsion, 1492, and then the Portuguese expulsion a few years later. So the Iberian Peninsula has spread into North Africa and the Middle East. And at the same time, the Ashkenazi world has left Ashkenaz and moved into East Europe. Both communities continue to define themselves by their places of origins. So Ashkenazim are known as Ashkenazim and Sephardim are known as Sephardim. There's a lot more to discuss about exactly the nature of this migration and to what degree they are indeed a continuation of the previous cultures or not. But for our purposes, that's sufficient. And along with this shift in population has, in a sense, this shift is linked to the closing of the era of the Rishonim, and therefore the need for a great work which will bring to a conclusion the work of the Rishonim and the onset of the era of the Achronim, who see themselves as somewhat subservient to the great centers that preceded them. So the historical context of this massive population shift leads to a rupture in minhag and to a degree and a new endeavor in creativity and so on. And this is all linked to what's going on. We also mentioned the first few generations of Ashkenazi leaders in East Europe, or I should say the first few generations of East European leaders, adopt this learning style known as pilpul, which is a pedagogic technique as far as we can understand. It's very elaborate, it's very fancy, it's not necessarily as rigorous as a peshat-based system, nor as rigorous as a legal system which would demand absolute proof. You know, when you're doing legals, you can't speculative. You need to legality, halacha, lemaisa. You need to have absolute ironclad proof. You need to be a little more cautious, maybe, and conservative, but less speculative. Pilpul isn't doing that, and that generation of leaders primarily define themselves as Rosh Yeshiva. They paskined also, they had to paskin where needed, but we don't have great halachic work to them, and indeed we don't really have writings at all. It seems that they considered their primary objective to generate a new Mokum Torah in Poland. That was their mission, that was their project, and in fact most of their names, Rabbi Yaakov Polak, Rabbi Shalom Shachna, most of these names are not even known particularly well, and yet they are the Rebbes, and in many cases the fathers-in-law of the next generation of leaders who are extraordinarily well known. The Ramah, Moshe Isserles, who's our focus today, Ramah Chayafa, the Levush, the Marshal, the Maharal, the brother of the Maharal, and the like. So there's a whole generation of leaders who are students of the founding fathers of East European, and they revert back to a more halachic focus, to a more peshat focus, to a more rigorous method of learning, rather than this sort of style of pilpul that we don't really engage in so much nowadays. In addition, around the same time, there's considerable Jewish autonomy emerging. There isn't quite yet the Vard Arba Harotzos, the Council of the Four Lands, which comes along later, which is a type of Jewish government, semi-quasi-governmental authority. It has some autonomy and some authority over the population, the Jewish population of East Europe. But there is already proto versions of this. They're given greater autonomy. Basically, from the 1330s and on, Kazimir the Great and his successors are very keen to encourage a Jewish population to move in, to develop the Polish economy, to develop a middle class, And until really the Chmielnicki risings, this is known as the golden era of Poland, where there's enormous population growth, wealth growth. And as we've discussed before, when you have population growth and wealth, you need those two in order to sustain a Torah center. The Torah center can never support an overly large number of Torah learners unless there's a large population and money there to allow that to flourish. So this is the world into which the Ramah is born. He's born in 1530, dies in 1572, 42 years old, as far as we can work out the dates. And he is a younger contemporary of Rabbi Yosef Karo. Rabbi Yosef Karo is born in 1487, so he's more than 40 years older, 1488, I'm sorry, 42 years older than the Ramah, and he outlives the Ramah. He dies in 1575, 3 years after the Ramah. So after the Ramah only lives to 42, Rabbi Yosef Karo lives till 87, I think, and therefore the Ramah overlaps with Rabbi Yosef Karo. They're contemporaries, but in essence, really, the Ramah is 2 generations later than Rabbi Yosef Karo, and yet they have this remarkable relationship. So thus far, I think sort of in a sense a summary of what we've discussed so far. As I said, the Ramah is born in 1530. In his mid to late teens, he studies under Reb Shalom Shachner, who you mentioned, who's one of the founding generations of the East European world and a pilpulist, marries his daughter and is a contemporary of the next generation of East European leaders with whom he's going to interact and argue sometimes, including Reb Shlomo Luria, the Marshal, and others. He returns to Krakow, which is his birthplace, at age 20, at 1550, and it very quickly establishes a yeshiva there, becomes a Rosh Yeshiva. He sets up his shul, the famous Ramah shul. He's appointed a Dayan of Krakow at age 23 in 1553. And then on Lag BaOmer in 1572, he dies. So he's a prodigy. He's a young Rav. At a very young age, he achieves a place of prominence. Just to talk about sort of historical sites, as I mentioned, he founds a shul, the Ramah shul, which is still visited today in Krakow. He's the Rav of the shul. He names the shul or dedicates the shul after the memory of 3 of his relatives who tragically died all within a very short space of time. His wife, his mother, and I think his grandmother. So he sets up the shul there. And next to the shul is the famous Ramah cemetery, which of course isn't just the place where the Ramah is buried, but many outstanding figures are buried there. A little word about his lineage. He's known as Ramosha Isserles. That's where Ramah, the name Ramah comes from, Ramosha Isserles. Ramosha Isserles means Ramosha belonging to Issa or Israel. So back in the day, pre-surnames, people were often called after the name of their parents. So the S at the end of Isserles is the possessive S, like in many European languages. So it means Ramosha, who belongs to Israel. In other words, the son of Israel. Sometimes commonly, people are named after their fathers. So Ramosha Isserles means Ramosha, who's the son of Israel. Occasionally after their mother, or in one case, their mother-in-law. The Marshal is Reb Shmuel Edel's. That means Reb Shmuel, who belongs to Edel. Edel is his mother-in-law, a very prominent businesswoman who supports him. And therefore, that's the name he's known as, Reb Shmuel Edel's. But that's how surnames or family names, in a sense, work at the time. And his father is known as Isserles. Isserles is the diminutive, the nickname of Issa. And Issa is the Yiddish version or German version of Yisrael. So he's Ramosha ben Yisrael, so Ramosha Isserles. Ramosha belongs to Israel. His father is not a rabbi. His father is a prominent, wealthy businessman and uskan. That's probably how the Ramah can afford to be sent to yeshiva, because his father has money. His grandfather is a Talmud Chacham. His grandfather is known as Rabbi Chiel Luria, and we'll come back to that surname in a moment. And his grandfather's rather brisk, so brisk long before there were Briskers, long before the Soloveitchik dynasty and anyone like that. But there's a prominent Jewish town called Brisk in East Europe, and his grandfather is Rabbi Chiel Luria. Let me comment briefly on the family name or surname Luria. Even though people say there were no surnames back in the day, that means generally there was no government-regulated surnames. Surnames weren't as stable as they are nowadays, where it's sort of, unless there's some big reason for change of surname, surnames will continue for hundreds of years, perhaps. But certain individuals who are very proud of belonging to very prominent families would still use surnames to indicate they were part of that family. And the Luria family is a very famous family in Klal Yisrael, and the Ramah was a member of that family, though he didn't use the surname Luria. He didn't use a surname. He was known as Moshe Isserles. However, the Luria name he is a descendant of a Luria, and he's part of this very large Ashkenazi clan, rabbinic clan called the Lurias. Just to mention two prominent members of that clan, another contemporary of the Ramah, who we have no evidence that the Ramah interacted with, who is Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, better known as the Arizal. So this is a very distant cousin of the Ramah that we don't have any evidence that he knew of or interacted with, who moved all the way to Egypt. Rabbi Yitzchak Luria's father died, and he was fostered by a Sephardi uncle and was raised in the Sephardi milieu of Egypt, and then moved to Safas, where he obviously went on to become the most prominent Kabbalist of his generation and of really centuries. But he's a distant cousin of the Ramah. Closer to home is the Mahashal, Reb Shlomo Luria, who's a very, very important, slightly older contemporary of the Ramah, and a very, very senior halachist, and someone who we're going to see is a debating, sparring partner with the Ramah. They had many, many differences in halacha, and in how halacha ought to work, and in hashkafa, and how a Jew ought to live their life. We have no evidence that there was any personal conflict, God forbid, in this case. There were sometimes intellectual debate ends in personal conflict. In this particular case, we have no evidence of personal conflict, but we definitely have evidence due to a sequence of letters backwards and forwards, which we have, that there was extreme mutual frustration and disagreement between the two. These are two very learned figures who know each other from back in the yeshiva days, and they profoundly disagree about how halacha ought to work, and we'll come to that later. So this is the surname Mahashal or Luria, sorry, this is the surname Luria. The Ramah, sorry, yes. Yes. If not smaller than this, very, very small shul, yes. Yeah, very small shul. At the front is a plaque which says this is where the Ramah davened, and this is not historically debatable. I mean, there's a continuous Jewish settlement there. There's nothing speculative about this. This is definitely where he davened. We're not talking about it. It's an area of continuous Jewish settlement, yeah, there's interesting features of this shul. But thank you for that. It's a very small shul. In Krakow. They're in Krakow, where in the old area, the Kazimierz area, the area of Jewish settlement there. Krakow merged in Kazimierz, but the Jews lived in a slightly separate suburb or almost separate village. It was actually cut off a little bit from the non-Jewish area at the time, and now the whole area looks very Jewish. Be aware if you're ever there. There's lots of restaurants from names and Hebrew on the things, not kosher. It's culturally Jewish. There's a massive cultural sense of that. Krakow's become very proud now that there are not many actual Jews living there. They've become very proud of their Jewish heritage. Okay, enough with politics. So that's the Ramah's area. Let me, and as I mentioned, let me just talk a little bit about his influence in his life. He is a prominent Rav at a very young age. He is a member of the nascent Vard Arba Arotzes, the Council of Four Lands, which is just coming into existence, and it's therefore he's got, if you like, a degree of political power also. He is obviously a halachist, and that's what we're going to focus on. That's what he's most known for. That's what he's most prominent for. He is a philosopher, and we're going to come back to that later. He learns Kabbalistic works, but that's not the primary influence on how he thinks. I'll just comment briefly that the Zohar, which has risen to prominence, and we often think of as a Kabbalistic work, and it is a Kabbalistic work, can also be learned as a medrash of sorts. The Zohar is a medrash. So when the Ramah learns Zohar, we have no evidence that he's learning it particularly as a Kabbalist. He's learning it as a philosopher. And the Ramah sees himself as a student of the Rambam, Maimonides, in Moreh Nevuchim. And in this era of history, there's an Ashkenazi wave of interest in philosophy, and maybe for 100 years after the Ramah, there's significant learning of philosophy. Krakow is a Renaissance city. It's got the University of Krakow already there. The Ramah is well versed in Chol, and we'll talk about that a little later. We'll talk about his views around secular studies, Limudei Chol, and he's in an environment where he and his students and his contemporaries, figures like the Maharal of Prague, Prague's another Renaissance city with a university there, having students who are at least going to the universities there and learning about modern developments in astronomy and science and so on. And they're very conscious of modernity and addressing it. So, for example, the Maharal in Prague, who's very aware of modernity and has students studying university, is also one of the foremost critics of those who use intellectual and academic studies to argue with Chazal. I mentioned a couple of weeks back when we were talking about Rabbi Yosef Caro, the controversy around Rabbi Azariah the Min Adomim, Rabbi Azariah from Italy, who wanted to look at the dates of Chazal and question the chronology of how Chazal saw the founding early years of the Bayis Sheni. I've been discussing this in my Nehemiah share. The dates around the setting up of the Second Temple, the Bayis Sheni, are quite unclear. And he says, look, contemporary history shows us that Chazal got it wrong, and the Maral wants to criticizes him, writes a whole book against him, and Rabbi Yosef Karo wants to put him in Cherem, though the Cherem is never actualized. So that's the whole sort of scene that's going on there. It's a scene where Torah is confronting modernity in a significant way. Meanwhile, the Sephardi world has left this philosophical tradition and shifted significantly to Kabbalah. As we mentioned, Rabbi Yosef Karo is a Kabbalist. You've got sort of almost a switching of stances in that particular era. Let's talk briefly about works that the Ramah wrote, and I'll focus first on the less famous works, because we're then going to spend a lot of time talking about his more famous works. He wrote a very interesting work called Toras HaOlah, the Torah of the Olah, in which he looks at a sort of philosophical explanation of the service in the Beis HaMikdash. If you are philosophically inclined, the Beis HaMikdash is an important, it's important for everyone. If you're philosophically inclined, understanding what the role of sacrifices is important. He calls his work Torah HaOlah, the Torah of the burnt offering. He writes a work called Torah HaChatos, the Torah of the Chatos, which is not philosophical, but is a halachic work about kashrus, and a very significant halachic work. He wrote a very interesting halachic work on philosophical work on Megillas Esther called Mechiyayin, which, according to, as far as we understand, was composed over Purim. There was a year when there was a plague and Krakow was under lockdown, and the Ramah couldn't get into Krakow, and he couldn't send Mishloach Monos, so instead he wrote a sefer and sent that as Mishloach Monos to his father-in-law to give his father-in-law a bit of nachas at his learning. Okay, those are some of the Ramah's works, and some 150 teshuvos. He was writing teshuvos back and forth, and now we come on to his main halachic works, which are obviously the focus of what made him so famous. But before I mention that, I will say that by the end of his life, he is at 42, young age. He is the towering figure of the halachic world in Ashkenaz, and enormous respect between him and Rabbi Yosef Karo. Even the two of them disagree a lot, but they correspond to each other, and you just see this incredible respect between these two figures who never met but recognize kindred spirits. They recognize each other's phenomenal minds. These are two figures. Perhaps no one else in hundreds of years could have written what became the definitive halachic work, and they both recognize the ability of the other to address large number of sources across the whole of Torah, and as I mentioned, Rabbi Yosef Karo is playing with 32 sources. The Ramah is playing with even more. All of Rabbi Yosef Karo's sources, but many other Ashkenazi sources, just mind-boggling their ability, and they recognize in each other this phenomenal halachic ability. And famously, on the Ramah's grave is written the phrase "Mimoshe ad Moshe lo kom k'Moshe." From Moshe to Moshe, no one arose like Moshe. So famously, people think of this phrase as being used by the Rambam, about the Rambam, but in fact, it's there on this grave in Krakow that from Moshe Rabbeinu to Moshe the Ramah, or Moshe Isserles, there was none like Moshe, meaning to say he is the lawgiver. He has Torah Tzivul Anu Moshe. He has written the Torah for Klal Yisrael for all time henceforth. An incredible accolade for a man who dies at 42. It's just the mind boggles. And of course it was right, because the Ramah did write the Torah evermore. To this day, none of us ever would dream of touching a halachic matter without looking at what two figures, Rabbi Yosef Karo, and then the Ramah, if you're Ashkenazi and even if you're Sephardi, says on the topic, on the sugya. So that's I hope that gives you some idea of the stature of the man. Now, he wrote two halachic works, incredibly, exactly paralleling the Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote the same sort of parallel two halachic works. And again, you just see how uncanny it is, how similarly their minds worked between these two far regions, Rabbi Yosef Karo in North Israel, Tzfat, and the Ramah in Krakow. They both look at the Torah first of all. The Torah is, we can call it a type of proto-Shulchan Aruch. It's written in the 1300s by a Rabbi Yaakov, the son of the Rosh, son of Rabbeinu Osher. Rabbeinu Osher is a representative of the school of thought of the Bali Tosfos. He has to run away from Germany in the Rabbeinu Osher, the Rosh, lives from 1250 to 1327. The Rosh has to run away from Germany and moves to Spain. And there's this very exciting encounter between the Sephardic traditions and Ashkenazic traditions, and his son Rabbi Yaakov ben Harosh, the son of Rabbeinu Osher, writes the Torah. He's known as the Baal HaTurim. He's famous for his little commentary on the Torah, but that's like a very minor work compared to his major halachic work. The Torah writes a sort of quasi-Shulchan Aruch summary of where halach is up to in his day. And the first task that Rabbi Yosef Caro set out to do was write a commentary using the Torah as a springboard, an encyclopedic work on everything, on all the halachic development and everything there was to say around these halachic matters. And I mentioned the Rabbi Yosef Caro's halachic work, known as the Beis Yosef, which is an encyclopedia of everything. You can learn Beis Yosef, and if you're a reasonable level of scholarship, it will take you through in such a beautiful way from the Psukim to the Mishnah to the Gemara through the Rishonim, all these tens of Rishonim that Rabbi Yosef Caro is learning, and he'll give you this beautifully structured summary of everything there is to say on the topic. And it's an amazing encyclopedic work. And Rabbi Yosef Caro read the tea leaves and saw that it was time to produce this encyclopedic work. Then Rabbi Yosef Caro realized there's a need for a second work, which is a summary of the halachic conclusions that come out of Beis Yosef, and he called this halachic work the Shulchan Aruch, which is the famous Shulchan Aruch. These are the two monumental achievements of Rabbi Yosef Caro. Incredibly, the Ramah comes to exactly the same conclusions and decides the same two works are needed, independently, unaware of what Rabbi Yosef Caro is doing, and he sets out to write a encyclopedic work on the Torah, almost mirroring the Beis Yosef. It's quite remarkable, called the Darkei Moshe, the ways of Moshe. And he's in the middle of composing it when a manuscript arrives in Krakow, which reaches his door, and he sees Rabbi Yosef Caro has already composed the Beis Yosef. He was beaten to the task. Fascinatingly, in the Magid Meishorim, in the mystical diary that we have from Rabbi Yosef Caro, in which a Magid or an angelic teacher reveals various secrets to Rabbi Yosef Caro, he writes there that the Magid told me that there's a Jew in Krakow working on a similar work. Hurry up and get yours published first, so that you don't beat him to the top. Make of that what you will. Just an incredible story. But this is what we have. We have this all there. And Rabbi Yosef Caro beats the Ramah to the task, and he publishes the Beis Yosef. Now, the Ramah faces a choice, and this is one of the heroic acts of Jewish history. He can either continue with his Darkei Moshe encyclopedic work, and he can say, I'm writing a different work. His encyclopedia is okay. I mean, it's for Sephardim, and I disagree with a whole array of how he thinks. I'm going to write my own encyclopedic work, the Darkei Moshe, and we now have these two parallel texts going in parallel. And maybe, who knows how history would have evolved, maybe neither would have become as classic as they did, or maybe one or the other, or both would have become classic, and we would have had a divided Sephardi Ashkenazi world. The Ramah withdrew from his initial project of the Darkei Moshe, and instead rewrote his Darkei Moshe as a series of brief footnotes on Rabbi Yosef Caro's work, and that's now how we have it. So we have Rabbi Yosef Caro's encyclopedic work, and then a much shorter Darkei Moshe written there on the Torah, in which he, here and there, he argues, he says that the Beis Yosef missed out a source. I don't agree with his halachic conclusion. I don't think he summarized things quite rightly. I think he could have read sources slightly differently. I think the weight of opinion comes out another way, and so on and so forth. And that's what the Darkei Moshe is. So this is an incredible work of, at the time, it must have felt to the Ramah like sacrifice, but in the long run, achieved this sort of unified encyclopedic work. Then, we have parts of the original manuscript, yes.
Where is the Yosef Caro at the time?
Rabbi Yosef Caro is in Tzfat. Everything Rabbi Yosef Caro is doing distant Tzfat. That's where he wrote his Beis Yosef, the first work, and that's where the Ramah, and in faraway Krakow, the Beis Yosef writes, the Ramah writes his Darkei Moshe, and the two merge. There's even two iterations of Darkei Moshe Ha'aruch, and the regular Darkei Moshe, and it's complicated, but yeah, we have parts of it. Yeah, we have parts of it, yes. Yeah, a little bits on Aruch and other things, yeah. And he produces this short version. Okay, then incredibly, in a sense, the same thing happens again. Rabbi Yosef Karo sets out now to write a brief summary, a practical guide, which is a relatively short work, the Shulchan Aruch, compared to Beis Yosef. It's a very short work. As we said, Rabbi Yosef Karo originally conceived that it would be learnt every 30 days by people, and it's a very brief halachic guide. And the Ramah, who is working on a similar project, again withdraws from his project, and instead writes footnotes on or not quite footnotes, a certain sort of note, which we'll say in a moment, on the Shulchan Aruch. And now you have this kind of combined work of Ashkenazi and halachic psak. And it's really because of the Ramah that this combined work becomes the authoritative text, because the Ramah's footnotes on Shulchan Aruch, I'll explain in a minute why they're not quite footnotes, but the Ramah's footnotes on Shulchan Aruch is what allows you to have one work which now includes Ashkenazi and Sephardi psak, and in a sense they are the co-authors of the Shulchan Aruch. So when we say that we follow the Shulchan Aruch and halacha, what we really mean is we follow the Shulchan Aruch plus the footnotes of the Ramah, and together they provide the authoritative text of halacha. Now, the Ramah didn't write these as footnotes. He wove them into the text of the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch will write a halachic line, and the Ramah will then interject in the phrase, almost as if it can be read as one. So you could almost read it as one phraseology, and the Ramah would write his comments. Sometimes it would be explanatory, where he thought the Beis Yosef wasn't clear, and he would add a few words to make the Beis Yosef clearer. Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Shulchan Aruch, clearer. Other times it would be disagreeing. And other times adding an alternative view and the like. So he wove his additional comments in. Sometimes he would precede his comments with hagar, or the word note. Hagar means a note. Other times he wouldn't precede it, it would just be written in. Sometimes he would write v'yesh omrim, and some say, to give an alternative view, and the like. Sometimes he would just add in a source in brackets where he felt it needed tweaking, or he wanted to add the weight of an Ashkenazi posek to it. So he weaves it into the body of the text. The Shulchan Aruch is not a pretty text. The Rambam reads beautifully, and it's just a piece of art. We've discussed this previously. It's an artistic work. The Shulchan Aruch is not an artistic work. It's quite a lot cut and paste. Where possible, Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, liked using the language of earlier poskim. So he would try and cut and paste from earlier poskim. Even though he's writing a halachic guide, he would sort of cut from earlier poskim, particularly the Rambam. He liked using the language of the Rambam, and therefore it doesn't read with uniform style. And it's made even less artistic or less aesthetic by the Ramah's interjections into it, because the Ramah's tone is different to the Shulchan Aruch. So it's not a sort of it's not a schmuck read. It's not a sort of, you know, it's not an aesthetic or beautiful work to read, but it's a phenomenal legal code. Sorry, yes. Yeah, eloquent, yes, it's not an eloquent work. It's interesting that halacha can be written eloquently. The Rambam pulls that off, but Rabbi Karo and the Ramah either didn't choose to do so or didn't have the skill to do that. The Ramah names his work the mappa, the tablecloth, because of course Shulchan Aruch means laid table. The reason the Rabbi Yosef Karo chose the name Shulchan Aruch is because of a statement from Chazal. Chazal at the beginning of, quoted by Rashi helpfully, at the beginning of Parshas Mishpatim, Ve'ela Mishpatim Asher Tosim Lifneihem. These are the rules which you should tosim, lasim, to place in front of them. Pick up on this language, to place. It's unusual language to use for halacha. You would say these are laws. If you want to introduce a legal section, which is what Mishpatim is about, it should be introduced as these are the laws which you should teach them, or you should clarify for them. But no, the pasuk says these are the laws that you should place in front of them. So Chazal, in a midrashic comment, pick up on this language, and they say halacha should be taught k'shulchan aruch l'fanecha, like a laid table in front of you. When you have a table laid in front of you, everything is accessible, everything is neat, you can see it all spread out in a clear manner, and you can easily pick and choose what you need. You've got your cutlery here, you've got your plate here, you've got your cup here, you've got the range of dishes over there, and a table laid out in a helpful, consumer-friendly manner. So don't teach halacha in this very abstract, conceptual, disorganized manner. Teach it in a way in which it's tosim lifneim, it's placed convenient in front of you like a Shulchan Aruch. Now, was halacha taught in a convenient, accessible, easily reached manner where everything is clearly laid out? Well, very far from it. Because by the time you reach the generation before Rabbi Yosef Karo, if you want to know halacha, you have to learn the whole of Shas, and you can't even necessarily find your halacha in any particular Gemara, because how on earth are you meant to navigate through 150 pages of Shabbos, let's say? And if you want to know a particular halacha in Shabbos, how do you know even which perek to look? And even if you find the perek and you learn the Gemara there, but there may be another Gemara in Eruvin that you also need to know, and a Gemara in Sukkah that you need to know, and a Gemara in Krisos that you need to know. And this is the whole seal of the Talmud, which is sort of so interwoven and so confusing, but that's how the Gemara is written. Why is Gemara written like that? Because it's a different way of thinking. It's organic, it's recorded discussions, it's conceptual. But that's what you need to know just to know Gemara. You now want to learn practical halacha from the Gemara, where you have to learn a vast array of Rishonim. So you now have to navigate your whole way, not just through the Gemara, but through these 32 commentaries, the Rashba, and the Ritva, and the Ramban, and the Rambam, and the Rashi, and the Tosfos, and the Rosh, on all these sugyas in order to draw halachic conclusion. And then you need to learn the halachic works which aren't written on the structure of the Gemara, but written on their own order, like the Torah Shulchan Aruch, and like the Rambam, and like a whole array of other works. So how on earth are you meant to paskin? And this is what we said, it takes an encyclopedic mind, like Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Ramah, to pull this off. So it's become so complicated and unwieldy that there's very few people able to paskin at all. It's not, nowadays a communal love who's got a reasonable yadin halacha can open a Shulchan Aruch, open a Mishnah Berurah, and a Shvuah Shabbos Kol you can find the halacha and you can work out. But in that era, as the Jewish world is now spreading out and so much is going on, how is even a sort of mid-tier Talmud Chacham, how on earth are they meant to be able to paskin? This is a nightmare. So the Shulchan Aruch knows what he's doing when he calls his work Shulchan Aruch. He says, I'm creating a revolution in halacha, in which the whole Torah is now going to be laid out, because Shulchan Aruch Lefanecha is laid out as a beautiful laid table. So the Ramah calls his work the Mappah, the tablecloth. That's the name that he gives to it. That it's this sort of helpful addition to the Shulchan Aruch, and together they produce this combined halachic work. Yeah.
Last word. That's an issue.
Because
the Ramah is the note on his work.
Well, I think he deliberately writes it interwoven, so you cannot learn his comments without also learning Rabbi Yosef Karo. So he isn't coming to contradict Rabbi Yosef Karo, even though he disagrees here or there, but he's weaving it into the text. So he's very clearly trying to avoid it being an independent text. It can't be read as an independent text. In other words, joining the Ashkenazi and Sephardi traditions. And more or less, this is a slight over-exaggeration, the Sephardim will follow the Shulchan Aruch, and the Ashkenazim will follow the Ramah. There are cases where it switches. There's cases where neither of them get the last word, and there's a sort of weight of opinion against them. But broadly speaking, together as a team, they get the last word. He accepts it because there's mutual reverence between the two. In other words, they're crazy over each other. It's difficult to describe when you read the letters, the degree to which they recognize kindred spirits. They just recognize that here we are, far away cracker and far away fast, and yet we just think so uncannily alike, and we just both have read that sort of history and realize the same project is needed. And again, no one wants the halachic work to be disagreed with, but he recognizes. I don't know if he realizes the degree to which the Ramah helped him. Because what we'll probably only have time to look at next week is, in fact, we will only have time to look at next week, is enormous controversy arises about these works. No revolution can take place without pushback. And you could have imagined a world in which Rabbi Yosef Karo doesn't win the argument, and he doesn't manage to establish this as the authoritative text. After all, in 3,000 years of history, how many people establish authoritative texts? Well, we've got Moshe Rabbeinu with the Torah, we've got Rabbi Yehuda Nossi with the Mishnah, we've got the Chasimas of Talmud, the editors of the Talmud, who make the Talmud authoritative, and then Rabbi Yosef Karo and the Ramah. That's it. So the Rambam doesn't establish an authoritative text. He doesn't put it off. For all the greatness of the Rambam, he doesn't establish an authoritative text. Right? It doesn't become the last word in halacha. And the co-authors of the Shulchan Aruch establish, relatively late in history, a new. If you ask someone today, if you Google, I don't know, I haven't Googled it, chat GPT, ask AI, what is the code of Jewish law? The answer is the Shulchan Aruch. That's a remarkable feat. We're not learning this time about normal. We've never discussed normal figures, or Rashi, or Rambam. These are astounding figures. But we're learning people who pulled off writing the code of Jewish law. right? There could have been and should have been a different answer. The code of Jewish law is the Chumash or the Talmud, I don't know, the Mishnah, but the code of Jewish law is Shulchan Aruch. And it by no means was obvious that Rabbi Yosef Caro would succeed in pulling off this revolution. And and we'll see probably next week some of the criticisms of both Rabbi Yosef Karo and the Ramah, but I don't think it's obvious that this would have succeeded at all. I think it would not have succeeded without the Ramah. I think it's only because the Ramah interwove his Ashkenazi comments into the Beis Yosef that became the authoritative text. Because I don't think it could have become the code of Jewish law had it just been a work for the Sephardi communities. The Ashkenazim wouldn't have learned it, and then it wouldn't have spread in the same way. I'll mention while we're just talking about the degree of authority that it has, 2 points. First of all, the idea that there is a neat Ashkenazi Sephardi divide between the two worlds isn't quite that simple. We like thinking digitally. There's Sephardim over here and Ashkenazim over there, and sort of never the twain shall meet. They're two different communities. First of all, there's not massive differences in halacha between the two. There's many differences, but it's not completely two worlds. Secondly, there's many areas of overlap. There's constant correspondence between the two communities. And as I mentioned, there are occasions where the Sephardim will accept the Ramaz Pasak and the other way around. It's not like a purist divide. In particular, the Rosh, who is an Ashkenazi posek, moves to Spain, as I mentioned already, in the 1300s, and he has a significant influence on Spain, on Spanish halacha. And to this day, the areas that are regionally near Spain and less towards the Middle East, like Morocco, will often follow the rulings of the Ramah. Now, what's going is, in a sense, they're not really following the rulings of the Ramah. They're influenced by Ashkenazi halacha, and therefore they're following the rulings of the Rosh. And therefore, they are following what appears to be Ashkenazi halacha. If you've ever been to Gibraltar, for example, you'll notice this. So one shouldn't really think of Ashkenazim and Sephardim as two digital distinctions. There's a sort of it should be thought of as analog. There's a spectrum of perspectives. So that's the first point I want to make. It's not like a neat divide. The second point I want to say is that as authoritative as the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah were, it's not true to say that we 100% of the time follow this twin work. There are 2 reasons why they are sometimes not followed. The first reason is because sometimes there was really a heavy weight of minhag against their psak, and not on every occasion did they manage to shift the psak halacha, number 1. And number 2, sometimes there was a subsequent next generation or 2 following the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, a sort of weight of opinion that disagreed with their view. And when there was a preponderance of a disagreement against what they said, sometimes we will follow that. So let me just briefly speak about the reception of the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, just to make this a little clearer. So next week, we will look at the opponents of the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, this co-project, and those who believed the project either is flawed conceptually or practically speaking got it wrong. But within a generation, it becomes the authoritative text. So they win. It becomes the authoritative text. The next generation of rabbinic leaders and the generation after that embark on a project of commenting on the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. So a bit like after the Mishnah is written, subsequent generations now comment on the Mishnah, and Torah learning flourishes around the Mishnah, which is what Gemara is. And after Gemara is sealed, subsequent generations now learn Gemara, which is what the Rishonim do. Following the Shulchan Aruch, there are several generations where they are effectively learning, if you like, the Shulchan Aruch. Of course, they're also learning all the earlier sources, but many works are written around the Shulchan Aruch. And these are the famous commentaries of the Shulchan Aruch, such as the Magen Avram, the Shach, the Taz, and many others. So if you open a modern-day page of Shulchan Aruch, you'll see in the middle a bold text. In square font is the Shulchan Aruch. In Rashi lettering, in the middle text is the Ramah, and round the side is a sequence of commentaries. These commentaries are largely explaining the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, discussing their sources, and sometimes disagreeing with them. And they are known as the Nosei Kelim of the Shulchan Aruch. The literal translation of Nosei Kelim is the carrier of utensils or weapon bearers. So these are the armsmen, the feudal knights of the thing. They are there to sort of carry the weapons of the Shulchan Aruch. And these are the most senior poskim of the next generations who are writing their commentaries around the Shulchan Aruch. And if there is a preponderance of opinion in these commentaries around the Shulchan Aruch, a consensus against the Shulchan Aruch and Ramah, sometimes that is what we will follow. So when we say we follow the Shulchan Aruch and Rambam, we mean, I don't know, 95% of the time, 90% of the time. Sometimes there's minhag against them, and occasionally the weapon bearers of the Nosei Kelim of the Shulchan Aruch or the Ramah disagree with their psak. If one of them disagrees with their psak, we won't follow them. But if all of them disagree with their psak or a weight of them, then we might follow against the Shulchan Aruch. So a third way of thinking about the Shulchan Aruch being the code of Jewish law is the Aruch Shulchan and others use this language. Sometimes they talk about the Baalei Shulchan Aruch, the authors of the Shulchan Aruch, by which we mean Rabbi Yosef, Caro, the Ramah, and the next generation that coalesce around them and comment and give psak. So in a sense, that's the code of Jewish law: the Ramah, the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef, Karo, and a handful of very, very senior commentaries around them. Where are the areas that sometimes disagree with Shulchan Aruch because of minhag? Sometimes in Spain, as I said, and the direct descendants in Spain and Morocco, they will disagree with the Yosef Cairo and follow more the Ramah. In Germany, in West Europe, which is still a very important Torah center, they felt the Ramah didn't take into account their minhagim enough. He's a little bit more going with East European Ashkenazi halacha rather than Western European Ashkenazi halacha. As I mentioned already, East Europe and West Europe have been going their slightly divergent ways now for a century or more, and halacha has developed a little bit. So Jews of German or Yekish origin occasionally will go against the Shulchan Aruch, but paskin in line with Western European halachic tradition. So there are points in which they didn't achieve 100% complete domination, but basically, henceforth, these are the authors, the co-authors of the halachic code of Jewish law. I want to use the last few minutes available before next week we look at the legal philosophy of these two enormous individuals, just to speak about the philosophical views of the Ramah. And here, actually, I will give out a source sheet, and I'll also post that on the YouTube link and on those who are following in Zoom. If you just want to pass this, I'll take one for myself. I'll pass half here, and sorry, apologies. I want to pass these around. Sorry, here's a few more. I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the Ramah as a philosopher. And in fact, I'll post online. Let me just put this up. In fact, I'll do a screen share for those online just because it's easier, I think, to see, given that we've only got a few minutes to look at this. I hope people will be able to see this. Excuse me. Okay, I'm going to do a screen share here. I hope that those online will be able to see this. Goodness, what's going on over here? Why am I able to share my screen? Oh, here we are. Okay, those online should be able to see this now. Hopefully. Okay, so very briefly, I just want to demonstrate, just comment a little bit on the Ramah's philosophy. The Ramah is a student of the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam, the Guides for the Perplexed, and in here and there in his halachic writings, he will quote the Aristotle, Plato, and other thinkers like that. The Ramah's cousin, the Marshal, Rabbi Shlomo Luria, who we mentioned previously, has many criticisms of the Ramah, and next week we will look at his halachic criticisms. He didn't believe in this project of a Shulchan Aruch and the whole style of psak that the Ramah adopted. He had profound philosophical and legal problems with the nature of what the Ramah did. However, amongst his criticisms, he also criticized the Ramah for learning philosophical works. And we have a series of letters backwards and forwards between the Marshal, Rabbi Shlomo Luria, and the Ramah, in which they discuss this right at the beginning of Tshuvas Ramah. And Rabbi Shlomo Luria writes to the Ramah a number of things. He says, first of all, I see you quote philosophical works. You shouldn't be learning philosophy. And if you didn't waste your time on philosophy, you wouldn't have made the following halachic mistakes. And then he writes what he disagrees with. And he says, more than that, if you want to learn things other than halacha, I suggest you learn diktuk, Jewish grammar, because you made the following grammatical mistakes in your letter. So it's very interesting correspondence. And the Ramah writes back and says, I am relying on the Rambam in Nevuchim, though he quotes Plato and Aristotle, and it's from him that I drew my work. And anyway, I only learned this casually. It's not as if I sat there, steiging over these works. My main focus, my whole life, has been on halacha. Of course, I'm a halachist. Of course, that's predominant. But there are times when I learn Nevuchim, and I think this is important for spiritual development. As we saw, the Ramah wrote two significant philosophical works. And he says also on the subject of dikduk, can I respectfully point out you made a grammatical mistake in your letter to me. So it's very interesting, the correspondence. Again, I want to emphasize, I'm saying this humorously because it is funny, but also we're talking about giants of Torah scholarship over here. Now, very interestingly, and I just want to show you two examples of this, of many, the Ramah paskins some of his philosophical views, and they make their way into Shulchan Aruch, subtly, really, really interesting. What is Shulchan Aruch? Shulchan Aruch is a legal code. It's rules. Is keeping rules and halacha enough by itself, or is a Jew meant to do more things than that? Well, a technical halachic answer would be keep halacha, and that's everything. A Kabbalist might answer, learn Kabbalah. Well, okay, that's Torah learning. What about in the realm of action? Well, a Kabbalist would answer that inherent in the mitzvahs is great spiritual significance, in a sense, whether you are conscious of it or not. When you do a mitzvah, that carries in it the existentially, almost ontologically, the spiritual content, and that refines your soul in all sorts of mystical ways that you don't need to worry about. And you have the mystical impacts of the mitzvah. Let's say you have a mezuzah up on your door, and you never stop and think about the message of the mezuzah, but you have a kosher mezuzah there. You've done everything you need to do. You maybe need to be aware it's a mitzvah. Maybe you don't really have any idea of what the content of the mitzvah is, but you've got a mitzvah. Make sure you've shown it to a sofa, make sure it's kosher, everything else, you've done your mitzvah. How does that affect you spiritually? Because mitzvahs affect one, spiritually affect the neshamas. You shake your arba minim, you have no idea about the philosophical reasons behind it. You know you're doing a mitzvah, that's it. You've done the mitzvah. You want to develop yourself into a more great person, maybe you'll learn the Kabbalistic secrets behind it. How many of us actually know these Kabbalistic secrets? Relatively few. To be a Jew is to keep halacha. That's one way of thinking about it. An alternative way of thinking about it, which is pushed particularly by the Rambam in his Moreh Nevuchim, his Guide to the Perplexed and others, is no, you have to have a philosophical understanding. It has to speak to you. Mitzvahs mold a human being through the psychological and social and educational impact of what the mitzvahs are. When you walk through the door, of course you need to have a kosher mezuzah, but the point is that you're stopping and sort of reflecting on the message of the mezuzah. So as you step out into the world and you leave your home, you're thinking about what the mezuzah says: fear of Hashem, love of Hashem, Torah running your life, and all these wonderful messages. As you step back home at the end of the day, you stop and you focus on the mezuzah and you think about the message of it as tefillin, arba minim. Mitzvahs done without understanding of what the meaning behind them are profoundly flawed mitzvahs. Their spiritual impact will be negated or near negated. Of course, you have to keep halacha because we have to obey rules, but you're missing a bulk of what the mitzvahs are. Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, look at the opening words of the Shulchan Aruch. And I printed this here on the handlines. I'm going to point at it with my mouse for those online. Aruch Aleph Aleph, the first section of Aruch says the Shulchan Aruch, Yiskabe Kari Lamed Bebokel Avodas Boro Shehu Me Ora HaShacha. So get up early in the morning and daven. Now look at the second footnote of the Ramah, Hagar. So this is the second comment of the second line of the Ramah's writing in Shulchan Hagar. Shivisi Hashem the negdi komit who klal godol b'Torah. Awareness of Hashem awareness that one, quoting a pasuk, awareness that one is living in the presence of Hashem. This is a klal godol in Torah. Umaylas tzadikim, and from the qualities of tzadikim, that walking in the path of God. A person is never alone. You live in God. What's he saying? Halach is about God consciousness. Right? That is what he's saying. He's passing this in Shulchan Aruch. You can't just write a code of Jewish law and start with technical halachas. The Shulchan Aruch goes on, I didn't print the whole length. He goes on and describes all the halachas of getting up in the morning and all the mitzvahs you need to do. That's not enough, says the Ramah. The point, the klal gadol b'Torah, is God consciousness, is awareness of the divine in our lives. And only if you do this have you really fulfilled the mitzvahs properly. And he goes on and so on. We're not going to read the whole thing. I've given you the printout so you can have a look at this. And look what he quotes as his source. This is the the sort of penultimate, the last line in the middle paragraph of the Ramah. Note the Ramah is introduced with the word Haggah, right? You can say put it in the bold font. He writes, the source is Mo'en Avuchim, Chelet Gimel, Perek Nun Beis. So the Mo'en Avuchim, written as a philosophical work, makes its way into Shulchan Aruch as a halachic source. Very, very interesting. So this is one example of how the Ramah weaves, again, it's halachic work. We're not expecting groundbreaking philosophy in this work, but he weaves a Mo'en Avuchim point into the Shulchan Aruch, and so Shulchan Aruch can't just be a work of technical laws. There's a point behind it which you need to be aware of, which, if you need to summarize an halachic work in one line, is Shavis Hashem L'negdi Tomid. There's a pasuk. Of course, Rabbi Yosef Karo doesn't disagree with it, but the question is where you lay the emphasis and how you sort of frame Judaism. And the Ramah, as in halachic work, thinks it's an important source. Let's turn to the bottom of the page now, the second source, and with this we will have to conclude today. Yeridea. This is in Yeridea, in Hilchos Talmud Torah, the laws of learning Torah. The Shulchan Aruch opens with quoting a Gemara, Chayv Odom L'Shalish Limudoi. Person has to divide their day into three. Shlish B'Torah Sheb'Chsav. A third of the day should be spent, or a third of your learning day at least should be spent on the written Torah, which is Nach. A third of the day b'Mishnah. And a third of the day in Talmud. Okay, so if you want to have a healthy buffet, a healthy smorgasbord of a healthy diet of Jewish learning, learn Chumash, Tanakh, Mishnah, and Gemara, and you will know how to live your life and be everything that a Jew needs to be. As the Ramah in the footnote at the bottom, in again his zakar, or Mikol Mokum, nonetheless, this is at the end of the paragraph in bold, Mutter Lilmoid Ba'akroi. You're allowed to learn temporarily, but Akroi means we use the phrase kaveya itim in the Torah. So the kaviyot is Torah, and that's what you need to make sure you have every day as part of your core curriculum. That's what the Gemara means when it says shlish b'der, shlish b'der. Your day needs to have the kaviyot of Talmud Torah. However, fill in also with a different sort of learning. In other words, you don't need to be kaveya itim the philosophy or the science. That doesn't have to be part of it. You don't have daf hayomi or philosophy or science. But this is also something that it's appropriate and certainly mutter to learn. The Ramah begins by mutter. In a moment, he's going to shift to appropriate, which we'll see about shortly in an astounding statement. Now, the Ramah says that, but you don't need to kaveya itim, but it's also mutter to learn b'shar chochmas, other wisdoms in science and philosophy, as long as it's not heresy. Then he carries on, where do I get this from Chazal? Where do I get this idea that you can learn other wisdoms from? Now, there is a phrase in Chazal in which they talk about being metayel papadas, wandering in the orchard. What does this refer to? Some other pursuit, intellectual pursuit that the sages engaged in, which many took to be mysticism. And the Gemara links this tiul papadas, this wandering in the orchard, to refer to Ma'aseh Bereshis and Ma'aseh Mekova, the actions of Bereshit, the creation of the world, the secrets of the creation of the world, and the secrets of the chariot, Ma'aseh Mekova, how, broadly speaking, how Hashem runs the world. For anyone familiar with Kabbalistic terminology, these are really, really key words, Ma'aseh Bereshis, Ma'aseh Mekova, tiul papadas, and so on. The Ramah says no. When Chazal talk about tiul papadas, wandering in the orchard, they are referring to learning science and philosophy. V'zehu nikra, let's carry on the Ramah. Bein hachachamim, this is what the sages Chazal called tiul papadas. And this is wandering in the orchard. Then he carries on. Ve'ein la'adam l'tayil papadas, rak la'achas shemola kreisi bosa v'yayin, v'leita isa v'heta v'dina mitzvahs. Of course, you first have to know halacha. One second, Avram. You first have to know what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. And then you should learn and wander in padas, and it's a good thing to learn padas. Who does he quote from? Rambam Sof Madar, the Rambam in his Hilchos Madar, Perik Dalet Mehilchos Yesodei HaTorah, etc. So he's quoting the Rambam. In which volume of the Rambam? The first volume of the Rambam, which deals with philosophical matters. This is where the Rambam paskins philosophy, the most controversial part of the Yad HaChazak, of the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam. So he's quoting the Rambam, who says you should do this. And the Rambam, by the way, if anyone now looks at the reference to the Ramah, they will discover the Rambam devotes chapters to discussing science and philosophy at that point. And the Rambam says this is Ma'aseh Bereshis, controversially says this is Ma'aseh Bereshis and Ma'aseh Mekova. Sorry, Avram. The Gemara says that many entered the padas and didn't do well, and we know to this day many explore the worlds of philosophy and science and end up as heretics. That is a fact. And the Gemara says don't learn books of heresy. You have to be careful. However, with caution, it's mutter to do, and not just mutter, it's a spiritually developing pursuit. That's what Tzil B'Pardes is, but be very careful about this, absolutely. The Vilna Gaon on the Ramah writes the following concept. So why, here he alludes to it, and elsewhere he uses a very famous line. In fact, I could have put this as a source also, another source. The Gaon says, why are you quoting Rambam to us? Everyone knows that in this respect, the Rambam lost the argument. No one thinks he should be learning philosophy anymore. He says, Kava, in a different context, which I'll share with you in a moment, he says, Kava hika usal kodkodo. They already wrapped the Rambam on his skull for saying these things. You know, the Rambam was and we know, again, whole controversy raising around the work of the Rambam. The Kabbalists have won the argument. That's not what Ma'aseh Bereishis and Ma'aseh Makova means. It's not what Tzil B'Pardes means. The Rambam, we would say, got wrapped on his knuckles. The Gaon says he got wrapped on his kodkodo in his skull. The Rambam already got beaten up for this view. Why, wonderful Ramah, are you quoting the Rambam on this? But the Ramah was quoting the Rambam on this. The Ramah was part of a sort of Renaissance, proto-Renaissance world, in a Ashkenazi world that had become interested in philosophy. I'll just mention, I could have printed this as a source and forgot to. Now, there's another example of this in the Ramah. I'm not going to go into this in depth, but there is a philosophical divide between the Rambam and others about whether magic and astrology really exists or not. The Rambam is I don't like this phrase, I've discussed before, but he's a rationalist. He doesn't believe in philosophy, doesn't believe in magic, doesn't believe in astrology. Those that argue the Rambam say, of course you have to believe in these things. The Torah is full of magic and astrology. The Torah says, don't do it. It's forbidden, but it exists. Look at Egypt and all the magician works in Egypt. The whole Torah is full of don't do magic and so on and so forth. And the Rambam says, no, it's illusion, it's trickery. That's why the Torah says don't do it, because it's deceptive, but it doesn't really exist. It's foolish, because astrology is going to misguide you, but it doesn't really exist. And there's a whole exposition in the Rambam and the writings of his son and student, Rabbi Rambam, how to justify that in line with Tanakh. Now, there's a halachic ramification. When the Torah says don't do astrology or don't do magic, is this real magic that really exists? Or is this illusion because real magic doesn't exist? Says the Ramah in his Shulchan Aruch Pesak, we're talking about illusion over here because real magic doesn't exist. And it is there that the Gaon again writes his comment, why are you passing like the Rambam when everyone knows the Rambam got it wrong with magic and astrology? Of course it does exist. But again, the Ramah disagrees. I'm not arguing here or claiming that the Ramah's philosophical views, influences the whole course of his Pesak and the whole of Halach and so on. There's a handful of cases, but I just share this with you to demonstrate what was a very interesting intellectual trend going on at the time, in which remarkably Jews in East Europe were now the heirs to the tradition, the philosophical tradition, whilst it was neglected in a sense in its original homeland of Spain and Spanish diaspora. Okay, we'll stop today because we have run out of time, and I wish everyone a good day. Next week in Mitzvah Hashem, we will finish off the Ramah. We will conclude our comments on the Ramah and Rabbi Yosef Caro, and try and look at their legal philosophy, which of course is what they stood for. And then in Mitzvah Hashem, then that will be the recess for the summer. So next week will be our last, and I'll share till after the summer break. I wish everyone a wonderful day. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.